Lucretia, painted in 1666 by Rembrandt van Rijn, and located at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, depicts through an image of acute suffering the tragedy of life in an inimical world, played on the stage of an ancient Roman legend of a heroine whose loyalty to values made her life unlivable. The painting presents the half-length figure of a woman brightly illuminated against a dark background. She is finely dressed, but her clothes are disheveled, and her outer gown is slipping from her shoulders. Below her breast is a wound which spills blood down the front of her chemise. In one hand she holds a dagger, in the other she holds the end of a delicately frilled rope. Her tearful eyes gaze down at the hand holding the rope. The subject of this painting is a legendary story taken from ancient Roman history. According to Livy's History of Rome, Lucretia was the wife of a Roman prince who boasted of her virtue and chastity. A fellow prince, Sextus Tarquinius, son of the seventh and final king of Rome, was envious of her virtue. While her husband was away, Sextus stole into Lucretia's bedroom in the middle of the night. He awoke her and gave her a choice. She could either sleep with him or he would kill her and her slave, place their bodies together on the bed, and claim that he had caught them in an adultery and slain them. Refusing to allow her name to be dishonored, she submitted to his lust. Afterwards, Lucretia summoned her father and husband to return home. When they arrived, she told them of the crime, demanded justice for Sextus, and plunged a knife into her breast. The story presents a dramatically rich conflict. The heroine must make an impossible choice, to die in disgrace or survive by surrendering to evil. Rembrandt presents the story at the moment of its resolution, after Lucretia has impaled herself on the knife, and moments before she will die. In Livy's account, Lucretia takes her life against the protest of her onlookers, claiming that though she is sinless, she must be punished for the crime of adultery. She is therefore made a model of the solemn devotion to chastity, an absolute moral duty. Rembrandt's focus, however, is not necessarily her moral strength, but the tragedy of the choice that comes from it. Rembrandt isolates the figure dramatically by placing her brightly lit against an obscured and hastily brushed-in environment. The rope in her hand has been interpreted as a bell pull, perhaps intended to symbolize Lucretia's call for help. It has also been interpreted as a curtain rope, a means of emphasizing the theatrical qualities of the scene. As though with the drama now resolved, Lucretia pulls the curtain to close the final act. And if we look closely, we can see there is a curtain behind her. I think both of these are valid interpretations, and perhaps Rembrandt intended us to see it both ways. Personally, given Livy's account of the suicide occurring in Lucretia's bedroom, I've always seen the rope as a decorative curtain tie, the type suspended from the post of a canopy bed and used to tie the curtain to the post. And these broad horizontal brushstrokes would then be her bedspread. Having plunged the knife, Lucretia reels on her feet. Falling back onto the bed, she grabs at the nearest thing, the curtain tie. Her fixation upon the rope at this moment is fitting. The rope, a symbol of her marriage bed, represents both her marital devotion and the form of her defilement. Regardless of the specific identification of these background elements, which we can only speculate on, her outstretched hand does play a crucial role in establishing the theme of the painting. Having committed the fatal act, the figure's attention is directed not to her weapon, but to this hand reaching out for support. As though in the moment of her death she has an acute awareness of what is left of her life, and she mourns the tragedy of its loss. Rembrandt goes to great lengths, by means of composition, lighting, and brushwork, to stress the relationship between her gaze and this outstretched hand. The Minneapolis Lucretia is the third of Rembrandt's treatments of this subject, the first of which was painted sometime before 1658 and is now lost. The second was made in 1664 and is housed at the National Gallery in Washington. This second version depicts the heroine in the moment before her suicide, her arms theatrically outstretched before her, and her gaze fixated on the dagger, with a more explicitly artful composition, balanced with the classic shape of a pyramid. Here the suggestion of a pyramid is interrupted by the figure's upraised left arm and the abrupt vertical line of the rope in her hand. A formulaic architecture was apparently antithetical to Rembrandt's purpose. He wanted our eyes to slide over the surface, to get lost in the confusion of masses, sometimes obscured between dark and light, background and foreground. In doing so, the essential relationships emerge by means of more subtle compositional devices. And though not formulaic, there is an architecture to this composition. The interrupted pyramid, for instance, places a thematic emphasis on the upraised hand. The importance of this hand is further reinforced by the positioning of Lucretia's head. Her face is framed by shining spherical gems, likely pearls, one on her earring, another at the center of her forehead, just above her hairline, but not here. Just as in the overall structure of the composition, so here we expect the pyramid to be completed by a second earring. But this side of her face is cast in darkness, and her head is turned, creating an interruption in the expected rhythm. But by following the line of her glance, we are led back to the hand, below which at the end of the rope is a third shining ball. This asymmetrical triangle created by these spheres is an echo of the larger triangle created by the face and hands, and a smaller triangle formed from the gem in her hair and the two glittering tears in her eyes. Lucretia fills the composition. Painted roughly life-size, her closeness to the picture plane has a confrontational effect on the viewer. She is to some extent removed from her legendary aspect and placed in a shared space with the viewer. As a result, her suffering is made all the more real to us, as though we are onlookers in her suicide, unable to stop her in time. This confrontational effect is enhanced by Rembrandt's selective use of light and color. Influenced by the tenebrism of Caravaggio's compositions, Rembrandt similarly illuminates his figure by a spotlight in a darkened environment. But whereas Caravaggio omitted so much from his composition by a more or less blackened background, Rembrandt omits more by obfuscation. By dim lighting, he gives a hazy suggestion of a background, from which the figure emerges like a solid congealing from a liquid pool. Rembrandt performs the perceptual process for the viewer by focusing and unfocusing our eyes. The brightest patches of light are the figure's face, her white chemise, and her outstretched left hand. The bright white of her shirt front is a brilliant contrast to the streak of blood, made all the more violent by its isolation on this broad field of white. Lucretia's face is the most strikingly lighted, strongly illuminated from the left. Rembrandt places a special emphasis on the eyes. Though half the face is cast in shadow, Rembrandt includes a small slash of light to illuminate this eye. Even in this low light, we see Rembrandt's mastery of illusionism, showing the subsurface scattering of light inside her lower eyelid, which has become flushed and puffy from sobbing. The figure's hair is spotted with glittering beads, indicated by tiny dabs of white paint. This creates a kind of halo around her head, pushing her visage forward from the dark background. This effect is repeated in the passage of her upraised hand. With her sleeve thrust forward into the light, the pleated white cuff forms a second halo around the rope end. This halo is conspicuously absent from the right arm, which is held to her side, and which Rembrandt casts in a dull brown shade, obscuring the color of both her hand and the white cuff. Rembrandt wants us to see her virtue. Her saintliness is her steadfastness, her upright devotion, even though she can barely stand. Rembrandt painted with a broad and seemingly chaotic brush for much of the painting, though in some passages his hand was slower and more precise. This contributes to a varied level of clarity, by means of which Rembrandt has controlled the intensity of the viewer's attention to any given area. The greatest clarity is given to the face and outstretched hand, though the presence of the brush is still very much felt in the slightly chalky, opaque buildup of paint. There is a greater precision in the shaping of the forms. In the modeling of the face, Rembrandt produces remarkably subtle modulations of tone, with the paint becoming progressively more opaque in the brighter patches, and the halftones scrubbed on thinly, revealing the brown undertone, and giving the surface a slightly glowing quality. The relative precision in the depiction of this hand is in contrast to the retracted hand, which is modeled more hastily and deformed almost out of all shape. Most of the peripheral elements are painted in a similarly loose manner, but Rembrandt used an array of techniques to create this out-of-focus quality. The skirt of her gold-brown dress is painted in broad swaths. Here the impasto modeling of the surface does not exactly correspond to the illusionistic modeling of the drapery. It is likely that Rembrandt built up the surface with a heavy and almost arbitrary impasto, and then glazed the gold-brown tones over this to model the drapery. The raised edges of the impasto catch light and give a glistening quality to the surface of the dress. The upraised sleeve of this dress is a patchwork of light yellow scales, suspended over the folds of the drapery, roughly modeled in a deep ochre. For the most part, one can see the shape of the brush in these dashed-in highlights, but in some areas, particularly at the figure's shoulder, it appears that Rembrandt used a palette knife to apply the paint, pulling the blade down over the rough surface, allowing the paint to catch wherever it may. The sleeve of her right arm is even more sketchily painted. Rendered primarily in a transparent brown, the shape of the drapery is indicated by lines scratched into the surface with the brush handle, revealing the underlayer of paint. This arm is further obscured by the broad brushstrokes to the left of it, which give little indication of what they're supposed to represent. I presume they represent her bedspread, but these brushstrokes extend from the cloth of her sleeve and somewhat match the colors of it, and so it may well represent the blurred spectacle of the motion of her arm. All of the above stylistic choices contribute to create an effect of a dizzying, indeterminate environment. Lucretia is cast in a nebulous world, and this is an element of her tragedy. By outwardly projecting a state of visual confusion, Rembrandt allows the viewer to peer into the mind of the heroine and experience her state of hopelessness as consciousness slips away. We are witnesses of her death from both inside and out, the tragedy of the event, and of that state of consciousness of which Lucretia was the victim.